The town hall of Shreveport, Louisiana, had seen countless meetings over the years. Political debates, school funding discussions, even the occasional church bake sale. None of them had ever drawn a crowd quite like this. Tonight the hall was packed, every chair taken, every inch of standing space filled. The air buzzed with a strange mixture of anticipation and reverence. At the front of the room, standing behind an old wooden podium, was Clint Eastwood. Even at 94, his presence was formidable. Time had lined his face, but his sharp blue eyes still carried the weight of decades. His movements were slower now, his once unyielding frame weathered by age. But there was an undeniable strength about him, the kind of presence that made people listen before he even spoke. He wasn't here to promote a film. He wasn't here to give a political speech. Clint had come because an old friend had asked him to speak. The town's pastor, Reverend Henry Calloway, had reached out months ago. Henry and Clint had known each other for over 50 years. They had met during the civil rights movement, two men from vastly different worlds, bound by a shared understanding that strength wasn't about power, but about what a man stood for. "Come talk to them," Henry had said over the phone. "You've lived a life most folks can only imagine. You've seen the best of men and the worst of them. You've carried burdens that others couldn't. I think they'd listen to you." Clint had hesitated at first. He had spent most of his life avoiding the role of a preacher. He didn't tell people what to believe, didn't lecture them about right and wrong. But Henry's voice had held a quiet conviction, and Clint respected that. So here he was. The crowd was a mix of townsfolk, farmers, mechanics, shop owners, young couples with children on their laps. Some had come out of curiosity. Others had come because Clint Eastwood was a living legend. And how often did a town like Shreveport get a visit from a man like him? Among them, an 8-year-old girl sat in the front row, gripping an old leather-bound Bible against her chest. Her name was Lily. The book had belonged to her grandmother, its gold lettering faded from years of love and use. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing the question that had been tugging at her heart. Her mother had told her, "You can ask him, but only if you truly mean it." And she did. Clint cleared his throat, his voice gravelly but steady. "I've lived long enough to see the world change more times than I can count," he began. "I've seen people rise and I've seen them fall. I've seen men do great things, and I've seen them destroy everything they touch. And through it all, I've learned one thing. None of us have all the answers." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "When I was younger," Clint continued, "I thought strength was about being the toughest man in the room, about standing your ground, about never backing down. And maybe that's part of it. But strength, real strength, is about knowing when to listen. It's about standing for something even when you're afraid." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Then came the moment Lily had been waiting for. The floor opened for questions. Adults stood up one by one, asking about his career, about the characters he had played, about the lessons he had learned. Clint answered them patiently, his voice calm but firm. Lily's small hands tightened around her Bible as she stood. Her heart pounded, but she took a step forward, then another. A hush fell over the crowd as they noticed her, the smallest person in the room, holding on to something far bigger than herself. Finally, it was her turn. Clint's gaze softened when he saw her. He tilted his head slightly, his lined face revealing something unexpected, a trace of tenderness. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Lily swallowed hard, her fingers white against the worn leather of her grandmother's Bible. Then, with a voice that trembled but did not break, she asked, "Mr. Eastwood, what does God mean to you?" The room fell into an immediate and profound silence. For a man who had spent his life delivering lines with perfect timing, Clint did not speak right away. Instead, he simply looked at her, then at the Bible in her hands. His brow furrowed, and something in his expression changed. The crowd shifted, leaning in as the moment stretched. Finally, Clint took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, more deliberate. "That's a big question," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." He paused, glancing at the expectant faces in the room. Then, almost to himself, he added, "But maybe it's time I try." For a man who had spent his life delivering lines with perfect precision, Clint Eastwood was at a loss for words. The question hung in the air, lingering like the last note of an old song. What does God mean to you? It wasn't the kind of question you answered quickly, not if you were being honest. The little girl Lily stood still, waiting. Her small hands clutched the Bible tightly, her knuckles turning white. The room was completely silent. Even the distant hum of cicadas outside seemed to have faded, as if the whole world had paused to hear what Clint Eastwood would say. He exhaled slowly, running his tongue along the inside of his cheek, an old habit of his when he was thinking. His eyes flickered over the crowd. Faces he didn't know, people who had come to hear him speak, people expecting something wise, something profound. But the truth was, he hadn't expected this. Clint leaned slightly against the podium, his fingers grazing the worn edges of the wood. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than before. You know, he said, I spent a lot of my life not thinking about that question. Not because I didn't believe in something bigger than myself, but because I didn't think I deserved an answer. A few people in the crowd shifted, exchanging glances. The weight of his words was unexpected. When I was younger, Clint continued, I believed in hard work, in grit, in taking control of your own life. Maybe that's what made me who I am. I never relied on anyone else to fight my battles, and I sure as hell didn't pray for things to get easier. A few heads nodded in agreement. This was the Clint Eastwood they knew. Tough, relentless, a man who had built his life on sheer determination. But life has a way of humbling you, he admitted, his voice dropping lower. You live long enough, you start to realize that some things are bigger than you, that no matter how strong you think you are, there will come a day when you can't fight your way through something. And when that day comes, he glanced down at Lily, at the way she was holding that old Bible like a lifeline. You start asking the same question you just asked me. The room remained eerily still. No one so much as coughed. Clint straightened up slightly, his gaze distant, as if looking at something the rest of them couldn't see. I remember the first time I really asked it, he said. It was in 1951. I was 21 years old, and I was falling from the sky. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Even those who thought they knew his life story leaned in closer. I was in the Army back then, he said, stationed at Fort Ord. One night, I hitched a ride on a Douglas AD-1 bomber. It was just supposed to be a routine flight along the California coast. Nothing dangerous, nothing special. He paused, then let out a slow breath. But then, somewhere over the Pacific, the plane went down. Gasps echoed through the hall. I was 21 years old, trapped in the freezing ocean in the dead of night. The pilot and I had nothing but a life raft between us and the dark. And let me tell you something. When you're floating in the middle of the Pacific, with nothing but the sound of your own breath and the waves slapping against you, that's when you realize how small you really are. The silence was deafening. I didn't pray, Clint admitted. Not at first. I was too stubborn for that. But I'll tell you what, I thought about it. I thought about all the things I'd never done, all the things I'd never said. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, someone was listening. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Hours passed. The water was cold. I could feel my body shutting down. And just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, the tide carried us toward shore. A shiver ran through the crowd. Even those who had heard the story before had never heard him tell it quite like this. Clint glanced at Lily again, his expression unreadable. You ask me what God means to me, he said, his voice softer now. I don't know if I have the perfect answer, but I know this. Sometimes when you think you're all alone in the dark, when you think no one's listening, something keeps you afloat. Lily's eyes were wide, her grip loosening on the Bible just slightly. Maybe that's God, Clint murmured. Or maybe it's just a reminder that we're not as alone as we think we are. The room remained silent for several long seconds, and then from somewhere in the back came the sound of a single clap, then another. Then, like a slow-building wave, the entire crowd erupted into applause. But Clint barely heard it. His gaze remained locked on Lily, who, after a long moment, simply nodded. And Clint Eastwood, a man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of silence, nodded back. The applause had faded, But the weight of Clint's words still hung in the air. Lily, her small hands still clutching the Bible, stared up at him as if she had just witnessed something profound, something bigger than the moment itself. And maybe she had. Clint sat back in his chair, letting the tension in his shoulders ease. He wasn't used to talking this much about himself. His life had always been one of action, not words, but somehow tonight felt different. The dim glow of the overhead lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the wooden floor of the community hall. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. As people murmured among themselves, sharing quiet thoughts about the unexpected depth of Clint's story, an older man in the front row cleared his throat. "I remember hearing about that plane crash," the man said, his voice rough with age. "Never knew it was you." Clint glanced at him. The man's face was lined with the passage of time, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned forward. "Guess you never forget the moments when you almost don't make it," Clint said, a small, knowing smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The old man nodded. "War does that to you." The words carried a weight of their own. Clint recognized the look in the man's eyes, the same look he'd seen in the mirror 1,000 times. The look of someone who had seen the edge of life and had come back changed. Lily turned toward the old man, curiosity shining in her eyes. "Did you fight in the war?" The man hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Korea. 1952. A hush fell over the group again, as if the ghosts of history had suddenly gathered in the room. Clint studied the man carefully. He knew what war did to people, how it left invisible scars no one could see. "Lost a lot of good men over there," the old veteran murmured, his voice distant. "One minute you're laughing with a friend, and the next—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Clint understood. He had never served in combat, but he had lived long enough to know that some wounds never truly healed. Lily tilted her head slightly, as if trying to make sense of the emotions swirling around her. "My grandpa was in the war too," she said softly. "He always told me that even in the darkest times there was still something to believe in." The veteran smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unspoken memories. "Your grandpa was a wise man." Lily hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. With careful hands, she extended her Bible to the old soldier. "This helped him," she said simply. "Maybe it can help you too." The old man's lips parted slightly, as if he was about to protest, but something in the child's eyes stopped him. Slowly, reverently, he reached out and took the worn book from her hands. Clint watched the exchange in silence, something stirring deep in his chest. The moment stretched on, fragile yet powerful. And then, just as Clint thought the night couldn't hold any more weight, a voice from the back of the room broke the stillness. "What do you regret the most, Mr. Eastwood?" The question sliced through the air like a knife. Clint turned toward the voice. It belonged to a younger man, maybe in his early 30s, his arms crossed over his chest. He had the look of someone searching for something, an answer, a truth, maybe even forgiveness. Clint exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. Regrets. A man like him had plenty, but there was one that had lingered longer than the rest, one that had followed him through the years like a shadow. He leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto the younger man's. "I regret the times I stayed silent," Clint said, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. The younger man frowned. "What do you mean?" Clint's gaze drifted to a distant place, a place that existed only in memories. "There were moments in my life," he said, "where I should have said something, where I should have told someone I cared or that I was sorry. But I didn't. I let time pass, and then, one day, time ran out." The room was utterly still. Clint looked down at his hands, hands that had gripped gun holsters in movies, hands that had built a career of toughness. And yet, for all his strength, they had never been able to turn back the clock. "People think strength is about never backing down," Clint continued. "But real strength? Real strength is knowing when to speak up before it's too late." The younger man swallowed hard, his posture softening. Lily, standing quietly beside Clint, reached out and gently placed her small hand over his. He glanced down, surprised by the warmth of the simple gesture. And for the first time in a long time, Clint Eastwood felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. A soft knock at the door startled everyone. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, clearing his throat. "Mr. Eastwood," the man said, "your car is ready." Clint nodded, rising slowly to his feet. He turned to the crowd one last time, his gaze lingering on the faces before him. The veteran, the young man, the child who had asked the question that had changed the entire night. Lily's voice was soft but firm. "Will you come back?" Clint studied her, then offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "If I do," he said, "you'd better have another good question ready." Lily grinned, hugging the old Bible close to her chest. Clint gave a final nod, then turned toward the door, stepping into the cool night air. The wind rustled through the trees, whispering secrets of the past and promises of the future. And as Clint Eastwood walked away, he knew that tonight, just for a moment, he had left behind something far greater than just another story. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. Clint Eastwood walked slowly toward the black car waiting for him, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin sentinels. He paused for a moment, glancing back at the community hall where voices still murmured in hushed tones. The echoes of his own words lingered in his mind. He had told stories before, on screen, in interviews, even to himself in the dead of night. But something about tonight felt different. Something about that little girl, Lily. Something about the way she had listened, her eyes wide, absorbing every word like they carried the weight of the world. And maybe they did. Clint took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the past. The driver opened the car door for him, but just as he was about to step inside, a small voice called out, "Mr. Eastwood!" He turned. Lily was standing in the doorway, clutching her Bible to her chest. She hesitated for a brief moment, then took a deep breath and stepped forward, her tiny boots tapping against the wooden floor. Clint waited, one hand resting on the car door, as she stopped a few feet away. Her face was serious now, too serious for a child. "I have one last question," she said softly. Clint raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go ahead." Lily glanced down at her Bible, then back up at him. "Are you afraid of the end?" The words hit Clint like a sudden gust of wind, unexpected and chilling. For the first time that night, he didn't have an immediate answer. He could feel the weight of every year pressing down on him, the memories of a lifetime flickering through his mind like old film reels, the gunfights, the standoffs, the long silences between spoken lines, the victories and regrets, the loves and losses, the moments where life had offered him a choice, and the moments where it hadn't. He looked into Lily's eyes, so full of innocence and wisdom at the same time. And then Clint Eastwood did something he hadn't done in a long time. He smiled, a real, genuine smile. "No," he said at last, his voice steady. "I'm not afraid of the end." Lily's expression didn't change, but something in her relaxed. "Why not?" she asked. Clint thought about it for a moment, then nodded to the Bible in her hands. "Because I lived the way I was meant to," he said. "I rode the long trail, made my choices, fought my battles. I took the hits, got back up, and kept going. And when the time comes, well, I'll ride off into the sunset the way I was always meant to." Lily seemed to consider this, then smiled. A smile filled with understanding, far beyond her years. "Like a cowboy," she said. Clint chuckled. "Something like that?" The moment stretched between them, quiet and profound. Then Lily did something unexpected. She reached out and took Clint's hand in both of hers, small and warm against his weathered skin. "Thank you for answering," she whispered. Clint gave her hand a gentle squeeze, then slowly let go. He nodded once, tipping an imaginary hat, then stepped into the car. The driver shut the door, and as the vehicle pulled away, Clint glanced back through the window. Lily was still standing there, watching him, her Bible pressed to her heart. For the first time in years, Clint Eastwood felt something settle within him, a peace he hadn't known he was searching for. As the car disappeared into the night, he leaned back against the seat, closed his eyes, and let out a slow breath. Somewhere in the vast stretch of time, the credits were beginning to roll, and Clint Eastwood was ready.